Happy Friday, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Cafecito with Mr. Miami Real Estate. We are here again today with Carolyn Martinez. She's the owner of CNC Title. She has been doing this for over 25 years, very long time, and she is one of the best out there, as you know. We do a lot of business with her.
Thank you.
Of course. So today we're here to talk about something very serious and very important, which are critical dates on a contract. So if you're buying a property as a buyer on your own, or whether you're using a real estate agent, when you sign that contract, you are the person responsible for making sure that you uphold all of the terms. If you miss any of the dates, if you don't perform certain actions, you could be in breach of contract, your deposit could go at risk, and the seller can even cancel if they choose because you breached the contract. A lot of different legalities apply. So we want to cover basically the different critical dates.
Sure.
So let's start. We're going to go one by one. Let's start with the first one, which I think it's the most important one, the effective date.
Okay. So the effective date would be the date that the last party of the contract, the two parties of the contract are your buyer and your seller,
Right.
the ones that last signed the contract or the ones to have any correction, addition, counteroffer, etc. initialed. So that would be considered the effective date of the contract.
Perfect. And then the next one is the initial deposit.
So the initial deposit, typically, if not filled out, an exact number of days would be 3 days after the effective date. The effective date controls all the dates forthcoming in the contract. So depending on whether you fill it in yourself or the contract itself is just standard on the days, that's what controls everything. So the deposit would be after the 3 days after the effective date.
Perfect. And just so you guys know, in case you're out of state and you're watching this, when we're saying standard, we're talking about the Florida FAR bar contract. It's the as-is standard contract provided to us. It's what's used for by everybody.
Pretty much.
So just so that you know the contract that we're referring to. So the next one is the loan application date.
Okay, so the loan application date, if I'm not mistaken, on the contract is typically 5 days after the effective date. So the buyer is also responsible to make sure that he contacts his loan officer and makes the application 5 days after the effective date.
Perfect. And we're going to continue into a very important one, and this is one that really tends to vary a lot. It's never the standard 15 days, the inspection period.
Okay, yeah, so the inspection period could be any days, 3, 5, 7, however, and whatever's put on the contract, the buyer has those amount of days to perform the inspection period. If he does not by 5 o'clock the day of the last day of the inspection day, that's it. The property is considered to be taken as is by the buyer.
Right. Absolutely.
And just to mention, the buyer only has to have his agent put in writing to the seller any objections he may have during the inspection period up to 5 p.m. on the last day.
Right.
As long as they throw it out there by that time frame.
So essentially just make a proposal by your due date.
Right.
Perfect. The next one is the loan approval date.
So for me, this is also a really big one. That's where your deposit is in jeopardy. If you have to make sure as a buyer that your loan officer will get you a loan approval within however many days the contract calls for, if it's 30, 45, 40, and if you don't feel like you're going to be able to do it, we strongly encourage that you get your agent to do an extension to that loan approval period.
Absolutely. The next one, and this is very important, not necessarily a critical date, but it should be mentioned, is the walkthrough.
Oh yes, the walkthrough is the day of closing typically, because you always want to make sure on the closing day, so usually in the morning, whatever it would be, you do your walkthrough with your agent, you check everything, make sure you hear and you turn on all the water faucets and everything works and etc. So we always try and make sure that as the buyer, you always make sure that everything's working in the house.
Absolutely. And as a piece of advice, guys, I would say it's critical. It's never happened to me. I've always done all of my walkthroughs when I represent buyers the day of, particularly the morning of or right before closing. But, there's been situations where people have gone the night before and the following day after they closed and they went back into the house, it was completely vandalized. Somebody had broken in. It looked like they had just partied the entire night in that house and left it to pretty much shreds. So the buyers at that point the transaction had funded, the seller no longer had the liability. So it was a big deal.
Yeah, exactly. I've even had a closing just on a sidebar where the sellers were here signing and the police was calling that the son of the seller was actually in the house taking out all the appliances. Anything can happen, so yes, you usually want to make sure you do them on the day of closing.
Absolutely. And the final one is the closing date.
The closing date is usually the same day as the walkthrough, but yes, the closing date is also whenever it is on the contract. And if it can't make the closing date, make sure you get extensions to the closing date.
Absolutely. So actually, I just realized that we may have missed one, and this is kind of important. If you're buying somewhere that is in a condo, in a condominium that has an association, or townhouse, single family that has a homeowners association.
Yeah, good point. So typically, the contract will call for the condo rider or the association rider will call for the buyer having, if an approval is required by that association, by that board, the buyer has to make an application to the association X amount of days dictated by the contract after the effective date. Because if they don't, the seller can also claim, that the delay was based on the buyer not doing the application on time.
Right. And it's very common. I mean, that's usually a period that it's very little on the contract. It's usually about 5, days from when you execute. I believe that's the standard. And, it's an issue just because many people want to make it through inspections first before they even apply to the association. But associations, every association is different, but many have 3 to 4 week turnaround time, which 4 weeks is almost as long as you have to close. So if you waited a week or two before even applying, you're not going to meet that 30-day standard closing
Very
time.
true.
So you want to make sure that you take care of that one. That's something that's often overlooked. And like you said, the sellers will blame the buyers for not being able to close because...
And it's not that they will not extend, because that's not true, or claim the deposit or whatever, but they may turn around and say, well, you know what, you're the one delaying the contract or the closing date buyer, so we're going to charge you a per diem now of $50, $100 a day in order to accommodate you because you didn't do what you had to do on time. Right. So it's going to be just less expensive to pay the application fee and get it done on time with the association.
Perfect. And not to get into too legal, but let's say a buyer misses one of these dates, they don't do what they're supposed to do, like the loan approval or the closing date. The seller has the right to back out or to claim the deposit.
Right. So most of the time the seller has the ability to back out or void the contract and move forward if it's a big one, like I said, with the loan approval. After so many days, the seller would actually have the right to claim the deposit or put a claim on the deposit. Doesn't mean that they'll get it, but anyway, that's, like you said, not to get too legal. And that's where it goes into battle, into court, and all of that. So that's why it's important for buyers to stay on top of their critical dates.
Right. So again, this is something that even if you have an agent, I encourage you to watch this video again, write down the dates, make sure that you look at your contract if you're currently purchasing something, and don't depend, just on your agent. Just make sure that you do your own due diligence, or you have an attorney looking out for you, or a great title company as well. So thank you for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you next Friday.